So we'll just back up just slightly. We had talked about John Wycliffe's translation, and so this is in the late 1300s. Let me just get the exact year here. 1380, he published the New Testament, and then 1382, the Old Testament. When I say publish, it's not on a printing press because that wasn't invented yet. This would be people copying out by hand, and his translation was made from the Latin Vulgate, which had been produced in 405 AD by a monk named Jerome. This is in the late 1300s, the first time that the Bible in any form basically was, or the whole Bible was available in the English language, translated from the Latin Vulgate. And we talked about how valuable it was. It would cost the average person a year's wage to buy one. And so I looked up Statistics Canada. As of a couple years ago, they said the average wage in Canada is $51,000. So if you think about it that way, to buy a Bible would cost you $51,000. And that's why many people would save for a month and they could buy one page. And they were happy to have one page. That's all they could afford. Maybe if they saved for a whole year, they could afford to buy 12 pages. And you'd have 12 pages and you would treasure them because that was all your extra money. So the first question, we didn't really...
What year was that?
This in the late 1300s. So 1380, the New Testament came out. 1382, the Old Testament came out. Well, and I talked about you could rent a Bible back then. Most people simply couldn't afford it, so you could rent a Bible for a day and read as much as you could, maybe try to memorize a few verses while you had it for the day, like renting a car, basically. So the thought occurred to me, it's one of the most important questions from last time. Why were people so eager to get their hands on a Bible in the English language? Why would they spend $51,000 to buy a Bible if they could afford it? Or why would they spend a month's savings to buy one page? That's a key phrase. There must have been some value. Yeah?
Would it be because this was pre-Reformation, but there was still some Reformation type thinking that the word of the Lord should be in the hands of the individual?
Yeah, well, I certainly think so. And John Wycliffe is referred to as the morning star of the Reformation. He was the forerunner for people like Martin Luther, and he had Reformation-type thoughts, and that's why he wanted to get the Bible. So most people at this time couldn't read Latin. The only way you could hear the Bible, if you went to church, they would read it to you in Latin. If you don't understand Latin, what's the use of that? But you were legally required to go to church. Everybody had to go to church every Sunday or else you'd get fined or thrown in jail. So you'd go and you'd listen to a service in Latin, you'd hear the Bible read in Latin, then you'd go home, you'd done your duty. It's an interesting thing to think about how almost starved they were to be able to read God's Word in their own language that they could understand instead of hearing it. It'd be like for us if we went to a service and it was conducted in Hebrew, and you were legally required to be there and listen to it, read to you in Hebrew, and didn't understand a single thing, and then you went home. And then the other question, I talked about how it was suppressed and people were killed. The church authorities were so upset with Wycliffe that, let's see, once a year. 44 years after he died, they dug up his grave and burned his corpse at the stake. He'd already been dead 44 years, but they were so angry that this guy had translated the Bible into English that they wanted to punish his corpse. He died before they could burn him alive. And so the question, we didn't really get to discuss it because the burglar alarm was going off, is why did church authorities and civil authorities think that this book was so dangerous that it needed to be suppressed and anyone who translated it needed to be killed? What's the danger in people like you being able to read the Bible in your own language? That's a very good suggestion. And so one point here is not just the city council, the mayor and the councillors want to prevent this. It's the leaders of the church want to present this. They do not want you to be able to hear the Bible in English or read the Bible in English. It's extremely dangerous for that to happen. Any other thoughts why that would be?
I don't think it's a danger to come in and not understand and not know what you're doing. I think the opposite.
Well, but control. There we go. And so,
if your question was what is the danger?
Yeah, what is the danger?
Sorry,
well, if you're going and you're hearing it in Latin, and then so somebody might talk to you in English and say, well, this is what it means. Shut that in your little mind, go home and shut up. Don't think about it.
Become educated, more educated.
The advantage of keeping the truth as if the church is allowed to expose the truth to the masses, it allows strict control. Whereas if the masses are able to read the Bible for themselves, it opens the door for interpretation, and the church loses control.
Yeah, that's the essence right there. And it opens the door that Sweetman has one interpretation, and Bob over here has a different interpretation. Oh no, there's two thoughts instead of just believe what we tell you.
Of course we know who would be right.
There we go. There we go.
Not always the bend for evil intent, although I mean, one of the roots of the issue is money, because the church and the whole church attendance tithing was related to money which supports the church. Mm-hmm. But it could also be for good intention, because by preserving the line of authority, it prevents heresy, perhaps.
Well, exactly, and that was the concern. So, yeah, those are good things. So, if I wanted you to go away with just two thoughts from last week, one would be, boy, were they eager to get their hands on a Bible? And number two, boy, was the church and the government dead set against that happening? And so, two opposite things there. An example of a dangerous verse, I was attempting to read it last time over top the burglar alarm, but it didn't work so well. And that's Galatians 3:28, where Paul said, and this was revolutionary in his day, but it was revolutionary in the late 1300s too. There's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you really ponder what that verse is saying, it just throws all social structure upside down that existed at that time. So in the Middle Ages, about between 20 and 33% of all the land that there was belonged to the church. And the church didn't have to pay taxes on it. At the time of King Henry VIII, it's estimated that the Vatican made 5 times as much money out of England than the king did. So the people paid taxes to the government, and basically they paid taxes to the church, and the church made 5 times as much as the government. So as you said, Steve, there's a lot of money at stake. So as a result of this Bible becoming available in English, in 1401, Parliament passed an act that allowed the burning of heretics. 8 days after they passed that, one of Wycliffe's followers was burned at the stake. William Sawyer was his name. So it didn't take him long to act. And then in 1408, they passed a law called the Constitutions of Oxford. This made it, number one, illegal to translate any portion of the Bible into English. And it also, number two, made it illegal to read any portion of the Bible in English in England. And so if you translated the Bible into English, or if you read the Bible in English, then you were in serious trouble. If you got caught reading the Bible in English, they would take your house, your land, your livestock, all of your property would be confiscated, and then you would be killed.
All this becomes a control.
Yeah, so this is a very serious issue of, it's one thing to say you can't translate the Bible into English. It's something else to say if you're caught reading the Bible in English in England, we're going to kill you. So that happened in 1408. So that finished off last week with all the burglar alarm and stuff. We didn't quite finish that. So tonight I'm hoping to cover the period from 1554 up to 1524. We'll see how far we get. In the mid-1400s, in all of Europe, historians estimate there were probably about 30,000 books in existence. They were all written by hand or copied by hand. Over in Asia, the Chinese had actually invented various types of printing where they would etch into a wooden block or carve into a wooden block a character, and then they could dip that block of wood in ink and then transfer it to paper. That had not happened in Europe. And then along comes Tim, if you could put up a picture of our friend Johannes Gutenberg. In Europe, in 1454, he had been working on this for years, but he finally was able to invent the printing press. And this used movable type. He'd have metal letters, and he would put it in a wooden frame, similar to, until recently, that's how it was done here as well. And this meant you could go, do I have more pictures in there, Tim? I've got a bunch of pictures of him. Yeah. So here they are looking at a page. This is sort of beard that Steve Sweetman should have. Yeah. So Time magazine in the year 2000 ran an issue where they talked about the most significant people and inventions of the previous 1,000 years. They started at, it was a 100 top thing, so from 100 up to 1 in the last 1,000 years. And by the time they got to number 1, the most important person, the most significant event that had happened in the last 1,000 years was this man. And he invented the printing press. It was revolutionary in that instead of writing things out by hand, you could print it and every copy would be the same. You didn't have to worry about passing it to this guy and he copies it and makes a mistake and then he passes it to that guy. He copies it and makes 3 mistakes. Then you pass it to her, she copies it and makes 10 mistakes. And on it goes, accumulating more and more mistakes. Oh, say that again?
He must have been behind the beard then.
Yeah. Well, no, not at that time,
No, definitely.
but now he is. So the first book that was ever printed in Europe was the Latin Vulgate, which we talked about last week. That's Jerome's translation of the Bible into Latin. It was a very highly revered book, and so they printed that. And so, Tim, if you could bring up pictures of the printing press. Each Bible had 1,282 pages. It was bound in 2 volumes because it would be too big. I brought this because this is what each volume weighed. 35 pounds times 2, so your Bible would weigh 70 pounds.
Wow.
Pass that around. So there's volume 1.
Okay.
So
Here's volume one, read it.
a guy,
Pretty handy for putting the briefcase.
a guy, 35 pounds per volume, so a Bible would weigh 70 pounds.
No, I probably didn't read it.
So I think it was in Washington, D.C., a thief decided to steal a Gutenberg Bible. And he snuck into this museum. It was like from a spy movie. He climbed down a rope from a skylight or something. He stole the Bible, he put it in a backpack, and then he started climbing up the rope. And because he now had an extra 70 pounds in his backpack, he slipped on the rope, fell from the ceiling down to the floor, broke his legs, and couldn't move. And they found him the next morning lying on the floor with 2 broken legs and the 70-pound Bible in his backpack.
When was it?
Recently, yeah, this in the last 20 years or something. So that's how I found out it weighed 70 pounds, because it said the 70 pounds in his backpack is what threw him off.
Sorry about that.
Wow. Yeah. Say that again?
Who was it that
Oh, the thief who had stolen the Gutenberg Bible.
This
Yeah.
is unbelievable. How could they do
Yeah.
this?
So, Steve, if you wanted to bring that to church with you, then one in each hand. So he printed, it took him close to 5 years to print 180 copies. Because here's the printing press. So these were printed 1 page at a time. And so, just back up there, Tim. See the metal part, you would have the metal type in there, and you would run ink over that, and then you would slide it over under that weight. You'd put the piece of paper over top it, and then you'd crank down, and I think we got some better pictures there, Tim, that would, it's like a big screw device. There you go. Crank that baby down, press that paper against the metal type with the ink on it, hold it there for a while, and then release it, and now they're looking at 1 page. And then you do that 1,280 times, which would take you maybe 6 months or something, and then you got a Bible after they bind it together. So it took them about 5 years to print 180 copies.
Someone, like, they would be paid to do that?
Well, yeah, he would have a staff. He didn't personally, so there's a bunch of people. This is hard labor, cranking that thing down. And plus somebody else getting the type already, the metal type and so on. And then they would hire artists to come in. Tim, if you can go to pictures of the Gutenberg Bible. He was printing it. He started off attempting to do color. It was really complicated. So he printed it in black ink, and then they would hire artists. Basically, if you wanted to buy a copy, which, by the way, this would cost you 3 years' wages for an average person. So 1 copy would cost you about $153,000 in today's money. So if you have a Bible, and if you didn't pay $153,000 for your Bible, consider yourself fortunate, because that's what a Bible costs then, the equivalent money for today. $153,000. So if you wanted it customized, they had a stable of artists who, if you saw any color here, some of the pictures that Tim was showing, like there, an artist would do that by hand, which would take maybe a month or something to go through page after page, adding in the color bits. There's 42 lines of print in 2 columns.
The question going through my mind is, were they devout purchasers or just looking for stats? Look what I own.
Could be both. Just like driving a Mercedes.
Yeah, be rich.
Could be. So, he printed 135 copies on paper. It was rag paper that came from Italy. It's not made from wood fiber, it's made from rags. And even today in the art market, if you want something that won't fade, you buy a rag mat to go around your picture, and it doesn't have acid in it. And so even today, these pages that are printed on paper are relatively white, whereas most books printed on normal paper would fade away to nothing. He printed, let me just see. That I'm not exactly sure about that. He did print 45 Bibles on vellum, which is calf skin. It would take 170 calves to provide their skin to print one Bible. And so Gutenberg had a passion for printing, but he wasn't necessarily the best businessman. And he had some lousy partners. He ended up with lawsuits, and he died absolutely bankrupt and destitute and depressed and poor and unknown. And yet Time magazine said he's the most significant person in the last 1,000 years. Gutenberg, Johannes. So of the 180 Bibles that were printed, there are 21 complete Bibles still in existence today. There's 49 in total, but only 21 are complete. And so of the 21 that are still in existence, 17 are printed on paper, and 4 of them are printed on vellum. The last complete Gutenberg Bible that sold was 40 years ago, in 1978, and it sold for $2.2 million US. And then 31 years ago, half of a Gutenberg Bible, 1 volume, sold for $5.4 million US. And it's estimated if one was ever to come up for sale, it'd be at least $35 million to buy one of these, because there's only 21 in the world. So Harvest Ministries, I understand, is interested in getting one?
We're in line.
Yeah,
We're in
we're
line,
line.
yeah.
Okay, in the line.
I think we're number 113.
Okay. So now and then, an individual page from a damaged copy, an incomplete copy will come up. And if you want to buy 1 page of a Gutenberg Bible, it will cost you somewhere between 50 to 150,000 US, depending on the condition. So
You get free shipping if you get it.
Yeah. Well, I think, no, the free shipping kicks in at 200,000. So you'd have to.
You're a chronic member.
Yes.
So 1 page is 150,000, you say?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's US, so that's what, 500,000 Canadian.
Another 30%.
Yeah. So I'm moving along in history. And so here's an example where when you talk about the history of the Bible, you can't avoid talking about church history and also secular history. They're all intertwined. So in the year 1478, something very important started, and it lasted for 356 years. It lasted until 1834, and it was called the Spanish Inquisition. Has anyone heard of that? And so this was in Spain, and the general idea was in the entire country of Spain, they wanted only good, pure Roman Catholics. If you were a Protestant, they wanted you out. If you were a Jew, they wanted you out. If you were a Muslim, they wanted you out. If you were an atheist, they wanted you out. If you were say you used to be a Jew and you had converted to be a Roman Catholic, they would torture you to see whether you're a real Roman Catholic. And so basically it kind of proves the theory that you don't get good information when you torture people because they'll say anything. But partly what they were looking for was if they put you on the rack and were breaking your bones and so on. Tell me your name again? Joan. So if they were torturing you, they would want you to tell them about other people, other heretics who weren't true Roman Catholics, and so they could get a list of names by torturing you. And people would give up their husbands or wives or mothers or fathers or children just to stop the pain. And
What scripture were they following?
well, see, this is why you don't want people to be able to read the Bible in their own language. So they had this idea to stamp out heresy, and the way they went about it was by killing people and torturing people.
And who did they? The Spanish?
This would be the Roman Catholic Church in Spain. Yeah. And the Inquisition happened throughout Europe, but Spain was particularly fervent about it.
So someone just had this idea and so they do this.
Yeah.
They thought it was a godly.
Yes. Yeah. And so the Spanish Inquisition didn't end until 1834. So it lasted 356 years. And so to this day, there's a lot of controversy about how many people died because of this. And somewhere between 3,000 to 10,000 were executed because they were discovered to be heretics, like not Roman Catholic. And but another between 100,000 to 125,000 just died in prison or as a result of torture. And so it was very effective because even today, I looked this up online trying to figure out what percentage of the people in Spain are Protestants. It's 3.7%. Everyone else is Roman Catholic. So apparently it worked if you want to keep your country Roman Catholic. So that's another whole topic. I've actually read a number of books about this, but I don't want to go off on a tangent. But this is happening in Spain and throughout Europe while we're talking about the process of getting the Bible into English. So printing presses really took off in the year 1500. So this is only 46 years after Gutenberg invents the printing press. There were hundreds of them throughout Europe. In the city of Venice in Italy alone, there were 151 print shops. This is how eager people were to get books. You could set up a print shop like those pictures that Tim showed us before. A very time-consuming process, but people wanted books. In the year 1500, the first Bible in Spanish is published. Now I'm going to talk about a famous guy in England. Probably for medieval or Middle Age times, the most famous king would be who? I know previous yet. Henry VIII. Henry VIII, I am. Yeah. No, you're too early. I'm only up to early 1500s. So I'm going to follow along. We're just going to have a little bit of knowledge about him because in the next week we're going to talk about him a lot more. He became the king in 1509. His father, Henry VII, died from tuberculosis at the age of 52. King Henry VIII becomes the king. He's 17 years old. He's now the most powerful person in England. He became king in April. In June, he married wife number 1. He had 6 wives. Wife number 1 is Catherine of Aragon. She's the daughter of the king and queen of Spain. Now, at this time, the most important thing that can happen for a king is to have a son. You must have a son. And Catherine of Aragon, she gave birth to 6 children. 5 of them died, either stillborn or within a few weeks of being born. Only one survived, and that was Mary, who became Queen Mary I later on. Henry VIII is not happy with Catherine because she didn't give him a son. So he decides, well, plus he has multiple affairs, constant affairs. He did have a son, an illegitimate son, who later died at his 20s or something. Rob Fitzroy was his name. This Mary, I'll just give you a sneak peek. We'll talk about her more later. She became the queen eventually and ruled for 5 years. And in those 5 years, she earned a nickname. Does anyone know what her nickname was? Bloody Mary. And that's because she burned so many Protestants at the stake that she earned the nickname Bloody Mary. In 1521,
So sorry, she would have been on the Catholic.
very much so, yeah. So it's like the Spanish Inquisition only in England. If you're Protestant, you better get out of England or you're going to be killed. 1521, Henry writes a book in Latin against the teachings of this horrible guy from Germany. Tim, what was his name, that horrible guy from Germany?
Tim didn't want to talk about it.
Can you hear me?
No?
No. Steve, who's the horrible guy from Germany?
Oh, it must be Tim's hero, Martin Luther.
That's right. So Martin Luther was starting to be heard, and so King Henry writes a book in Latin against him. It was called in English, it's called The Assertion of the Seven Sacraments. And the Pope was so impressed with this book that he gave Henry an official title. Defender of the Faith is Henry VIII. So that's all we'll say about Henry for now. We'll come back to him later. Now we're going to talk about another very influential guy. Now, Michelle, you might be able to tell me, can you think of any musicians or singers, etc., who are so famous they only go by one name? And you instantly know who they are. Anyone?
Prince.
Prince. Okay.
Elvis.
Elvis. Madonna. Adele. Sade, etc. You only need one name, and everyone throughout history knows who you are.
But you didn't ask me to think of a specific one.
Oh, no, no. They're just no. You say that word, and here's a guy 500 years later. If you say Erasmus, is this guy. His full name, well, his first and last name was Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus is his last name. And it's like Sweetman over here. You just say Sweetman, you know who he is. He's like Erasmus. So he's known by his last name. He's also referred to sometimes as Erasmus of Rotterdam, which is in Holland. And so he's a very famous person. He wrote 21 books, but he's most famous for he was the first person in Europe to publish a Greek New Testament. And this happened in 1516. And so here's a picture of it. This went through 5 editions. And so this is an amazing event. Up until now, if you wanted to translate the Bible, take your chances to translate the Bible, you had one choice. You translated from Latin. So Jerome, back in the late 300s, early 400s, had looked at Greek manuscripts for the New Testament and had translated them into Latin. From then on, any translation for the next 1100 years was made from Latin. Now, Desiderius Erasmus publishes for the first time in Europe a Greek New Testament.
What was that based on?
He had 7 manuscripts that he had scraped together. None of them had the entire New Testament. Each one had pieces of the New Testament. So let me just go to, so I get this right here. I'm going to turn the page here and then come back. 5 of his manuscripts were from the 1100s, and 2 of his manuscripts were from the 1400s. They were all of a certain text type known as the Byzantine, which we're going to get into later on. None of the 7 manuscripts contain the entire New Testament. For part of the book of Revelation, he had no Greek manuscripts. So he translated the Latin Vulgate into Greek and put that in his book. And so the way he did it, there's 2 columns. There we go. And the one on the left is Greek, and the one on the right in his first edition is the Latin Vulgate. So, interestingly, immediately, Protestants start translating the New Testament from Greek instead of from Latin.
Robert, can you explain what the big deal is about him doing it in Greek?
It hadn't existed up until then.
Yeah, but why Greek?
Why Greek? The New Testament was written in Greek.
Originally written, Paul wrote it.
Yeah, Paul wrote in Greek, etc. And so it's like going back, instead of translating a translation, they're translating closer to the original, is the idea here. Protestants immediately realized the significance of this, and from then on, as of 1516, any translation that a Protestant made was from Greek, and then when they got to the Old Testament, it would be from Hebrew eventually.
So, sorry,
yeah.
Manuscripts that he was using were Greek manuscripts?
Yes.
So he didn't translate them.
No, he was compiling them.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not him doing the translation, it's other people. So, for example, Martin Luther used this to translate the Bible into English.
So he was collating the material from the original Greek manuscript.
Exactly, from the ones he had. He only had 7. Nowadays we have about 6,000. He had 7. So he did the best he could with 7 manuscripts. That's why he had 5 editions, because when edition 2 came along, he found another manuscript. So he now had 8 manuscripts, and that resulted in 400 changes in the second edition. So let me just back up here and make sure. So does anyone know, the Roman Catholic Church held the Latin Vulgate in great esteem. And so does anyone know when the first Roman Catholic Bible was translated from Greek and Hebrew instead of from Latin? It was called the Jerusalem Bible, and it came out in 1966. And so that was, how many years? 450 years later. The Roman Catholic Church thought, hey, why don't we try translating the Bible from Greek and Hebrew instead of always translating the Latin Vulgate? So that was quite a new innovation there. They waited 450 years to do it. So I mentioned in the book of Revelation there were parts he had no Greek manuscript, so he translated from the Latin Vulgate back into Greek in order to have something on the Greek side of the page. And this happened. There were other spots where the Greek manuscripts he had, because they were from the 1100s and the 1400s, so 1,000 years and 1,300 years after they were written, and they had been copied and then copied and then copied and copied. They weren't great manuscripts, is the reality. And so there were times when, boy, that sounds kind of weird. And so there were a number of spots where instead of using what the Greek manuscript actually said. He translated the Vulgate into Greek. So that happened here and there to try to have things make sense. I went online looking for one of these, and you can buy, these were printed and there were more than printed. The first and second edition, they printed about 3,300 of these. And you can buy one, it's on sale right now on the internet. It's $95,000 US to buy a copy of this. So because it's less rare, I guess it's cheaper. 1519, so this is 3 years later, Erasmus brings out his second edition. As I said, he found one more manuscript from the 1100s, so he now had 8 manuscripts, and as a result of collating everything, he made 400 changes to the text. And people had pointed out he had made all sorts of typographical errors in the first edition, so he corrected most of those. In this edition, Tim, if you can bring up the pictures here again, the right column, instead of the Latin Vulgate, he put his own Latin translation there, which was a pretty bold move. So he had Greek on the left and his own Latin translation of the Greek on the right-hand side. And a lot of people weren't very impressed with that. So the second edition from 1519, that's what Martin Luther used to translate the Bible into German for the first time in history. And then in 1522, Erasmus brings out his third edition. He had made 118 changes to the text, and that's the one William Tyndale, who we'll talk about next week, he uses the third edition as the basis for his translation. He got killed for that. It's also the basis for the Geneva Bible, which was printed in Switzerland, very famous one. A lot of Protestants use that. And also the King James Bible used that. It came out in 1611. We might get to that next week. Now, an interesting thing happened in the third edition. Erasmus had taken a lot of heat over 2 verses. Does anyone have a Bible here with them? Is that a Bible?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is a church we don't have that.
It has to be on PowerPoint, I suppose. I should have done that. What version is that?
It's the Heritage Study Bible. New International.
Oh, New International Version. Okay. If you can look up 1 John, I'll wait till you get there. He turned towards the back of the book, so he knows something here. See, 1 John, it's not the Gospel of John, but the letter of John. So it's even further towards the back. And tell me your name again, please.
Gord.
Gord. Hey, are you my friend on Facebook?
Yeah.
Good. I talked to a guy, while you're looking, I'll tell this story. I talked to a guy I had asked months ago to be his friend on Facebook. He didn't accept me. And I saw him in person a couple of days ago, and he said, all people he was married to his wife at that time for 6 years. They've been divorced 12 years. He said, anyone from that time period of 6 years, it brings back bad memories for me. I want nothing to do with anybody from that 6-year period. Well, that's when I became his friend. I thought I was his friend, but apparently I bring back, and anyone from that period brings back bad memories, I'm out. So, yeah, it's kind of sad about that. Can you help him there, Bob, find this? 1 John. Oh, there we go. That's why that index is in the front. No, he said we had 2 conversations, one and then a second one, and he said he starts the conversation with no offense, but which means I'm about to try to offend you. But that was the story, and so he's been divorced for 12 years and is still just seething with anger, just eaten up with fury. And so it's just, I bring back memories from that time period. I had nothing to do with the situation, but yeah.
Also awkward in a moment.
Yeah, it was a little awkward. We got about 4 people working on this, Steve, trying to find this. Okay, well, no, I want to give Gord a chance. Okay, and then go to chapter 5. And this was the most controversial thing from his first and second edition. He took heat over these 2 verses, and so he put them in the third version, third edition. Verse 7 and 8. See if it's even there.
For there are 3 that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. And these 3 are one. And there are 3 that bear witness on earth, the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And these 3 agree as one.
Now, in that NIV version, are those verses marked out in any way with brackets or anything, or a footnote or something?
Well, it is a study Bible, so there is.
I'm surprised those verses are even printed there. So we'll read the footnote.
Okay, 5:7, 3 that bear witness. The Old Testament law required the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses to establish the truth of a particular matter. And then there's another scriptural reference. Then there's again some more description. In heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, 3 bear witness on earth. These words are a direct reference to the Trinity, and what they say is accurate. External manuscript evidence, however, is against them being on the original epistle. They do not appear in any Greek GR.MSS period.
Any Greek manuscript?
Okay, dated before 10th century AD only. Very late Greek manuscripts contain the reading, and these contain the passage in what appears to be a translation from a late recension of the Latin Vulgate. Furthermore, 4 of these 8 manuscripts contain the passage as a variant reading written in the margin as a later addition to the manuscript. Blah, blah, blah.
Okay. So the point being, John never wrote those verses. It's just clear as day. And so they appear, the data I had, they appear in the 1400s in a couple Greek manuscripts, and they appear in the late 300s in some Latin manuscripts. All the early versions where you would translate the Greek New Testament into Ethiopian and Syrian and other languages, it's not there. And so for some reason, somehow they got added in 1,000 years or so after John wrote his epistle. But there's an example. We're going to get into textual criticism later. I thought I'd just give you a little nibble there. So anyway, Erasmus took heat because of these 2 verses. He didn't include them in edition 1 and edition 2 because they weren't in any Greek manuscript that he had. And the church in Rome actually got involved. It said it's in the Latin Vulgate, and he said, well, it's not in Greek, or the Greek manuscripts. And this cardinal he was corresponding with said the Latin Vulgate is more important than any Greek manuscript. You need to put this in. And so they basically twisted his arm, and so he put it in. And then it ends up getting translated into the King James Version, etc. That's why we have it. And so a braver translation would not have those verses there. They might have them down at the bottom in a footnote, but translations take heat even today. I remember when the Revised Standard Version came out, people were aghast that it's the devil's Bible because it doesn't have things exactly like the King James and so on. But that's for a topic to come up. But that's the most significant and famous thing about the third edition, that those 2 verses suddenly get put in there, and there's very little evidence that they should be there. 1527, 4th edition, he made 110 changes, and interestingly, 90 of them were in the book of Revelation, and then 20 throughout the rest of the New Testament. And that one was printed in 3 columns, the Greek and Erasmus's Latin translation, and then the Latin Vulgate, so you could compare the 3 versions. And then in 1535, he brings out the 5th edition. This is just a year before he dies. He only made 4 changes to the text, but once again, he got rid of the Latin Vulgate, and so he left that column out. So between 1516 and 1633, various authors published 160 editions of the Greek New Testament. People were going crazy trying to get back before the Latin Vulgate, and they started researching Greek manuscripts and so on.
Where were they finding Greek manuscripts?
Some monasteries, for example, would have them, and the church in the East, the Greek Orthodox Church, had always had Greek manuscripts, and so people were starting to travel, and archaeology was starting to become a thing. And so, as I said initially, Erasmus had 7 manuscripts, but today we have close to 6,000. And many of those weren't even discovered till the 1800s, and many of them weren't discovered until the 1900s. And so as more manuscripts are discovered, and especially early ones, Erasmus's earliest manuscript was from the 1100s. But we now have manuscripts go back to the early 100s, so around AD 125. We have manuscripts from then. So way closer, and the theory being way more accurate than later manuscripts.
And we're sitting here trusting that all those manuscripts have, over time, been added in and understood by theologians or students of the Bible, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another act of faith that we're...
Yeah, well, and we're going to spend a night talking about that. So there's principles involved, and there's a lot of nonsense that you might see on TV shows and so on, the Gospel of Thomas and so on. There's hundreds of apocryphal sort of works that some people think, well, this was written in the 400s, and they claimed it was written by the Apostle Thomas, about 400 years too late, but we'll take that. And so therefore this is just as valid as the Gospel of Matthew, for example. So we're going to talk about all that stuff coming up. Right now, I'm going to try not to go on too many tangents, but we're going to talk about getting the Bible in English. We're actually not too far off the end here, what I had for tonight. Next week, I'll just take a brief break here. We're going to talk about William Tyndale. And here's a copy of his Contraband New Testament. 1526, this was the first English New Testament translated from Greek. If you were caught with this in England, you would be killed. But people smuggled them in, and people would learn Greek, scholars and so on, to be able to read it. And so this we'll talk about next week. William Tyndale, who translated it, they so hated him, he got 2 death sentences. And so they killed him twice at the same time. There's two methods of execution at the same time. They were so angry with him. And so, as he broke that law, remember earlier I said it's illegal to translate the Bible into English, and it's illegal to read the Bible in English. And so there's a Bible in English. It's contraband. And, well, I don't want to take too much thunder for next week. The Church of England took great delight in gathering these up, confiscated versions. They would kill the owners, and then they'd have a big bonfire in front of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, England, burning these Bibles, because it's heresy having a Bible in English. And one guy he helped, I'll talk about him here briefly, he helped bring William Tyndale to the Lord. they caught him and he was executed, burned at the stake. But before they burned him, as part of his punishment, they made him light the bonfire. It was right in the church, burning the English New Testament, because that's heresy to have the Bible in English. Anyway, that's next week. So back to this week, 1517. It's a teaser, you're right, to bring you back next week. October 31st, this guy that Tim likes so much, Martin Luther, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. This date, Halloween, 1517, is considered the official beginning of the Reformation. After that, everything changes. Now, the guy I was telling you about, Thomas Bilney, was a student at Cambridge University in England. In 1517, on the black market, he bought one of these. And he was amazed as he read the Bible in English. And
1517 was impressively later, because it wasn't published. 1535.
No, 1526. I'm sorry. He didn't buy the Bible in English. 1517, he bought a black market copy of Erasmus's Greek New Testament. Yeah, thanks for correcting that. This comes next week. So because he was a student at Cambridge University, he knew Greek. And so Erasmus had published his Greek New Testament, as I said, in 1516. So he's reading the New Testament in Greek, and he's amazed at what he's reading. I don't know why it hadn't worked for him in Latin, but it's interesting. You read this now and then where somebody reads a verse, and God smites them with that verse, and they're converted after reading a verse. And the story on him, if someone could look this up. Jim, do you have a Bible? Anyone else have a Bible here? How about Bob Dunsmore this time?
I didn't break my electronics.
Yeah, that's
Well, Steve, you got electronic Bible there? Okay, so look up 1 Timothy. They say in the story of him that he read this one verse and he was converted. 1 Timothy 1:15.
This is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance.
Yep.
That Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief.
He read that verse and decided, I have to become a Christian. God, this is in 1517. Well, Thomas Bilney. Bilney with a B. And so Thomas Bilney is one of these guys that you've never heard of. But God uses them to bring somebody else in who you have heard of. And so this has happened, we'll say, millions of times throughout history. And Steve's article in the last couple of weeks, he mentioned different gifts and so on. A person might think, well, I have no gift, what can I do? And sometimes I think, when I led the music here a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned my friend from Vietnam. I taught English as a second language to a group of engineers from Vietnam, and two of them became Christians. And I think that perhaps the greatest thing I've done in my life is help one of these guys become a Christian. Because God is using him. A whole circle of people in Vietnam have become Christians because of this one guy. And I had a bit of influence on him to become a believer, and then God is using that guy to bring all kinds of people in Vietnam to the Lord. And so this sort of thing has happened millions of times in Christian history. Here comes Peggy, Karen. And so Thomas Bilney is all excited. He's become a Christian. He has a contraband Greek New Testament. Apparently it was illegal to have it in England, so he had to sneak around a little bit. And so they had these regular meetings at a tavern. It's called the White Horse Tavern. sometimes known as the White Horse Inn. And they start talking about the Lord, and he shows them his Greek New Testament, and people are getting excited. Professors get involved, other students are involved. They're meeting at a pub, talking about the Lord, and this is basically the beginning of the Reformation in England. Happened at a pub, and happened as a result of a Greek New Testament. Well, one of his friends, who Thomas Bilney talks to him about the Lord, is William Tyndale. So Thomas Bilney later on gets burned at the stake. William Tyndale gets 2 death sentences, one of which is to be burned at the stake. But it's Thomas Bilney brings him to the Lord, and then he produces the first English New Testament from Greek. So that's an interesting thing to think about. 1519, so this is just a couple years later, 6 men, 1 woman are burned at the stake for teaching their children to say the Lord's Prayer in English instead of Latin. So these are English people, and you must say the Lord's Prayer in Latin, which you don't understand. So these 7 people somehow got the idea, I'm going to teach my children how to say the Lord's Prayer in English, since I'm English. And somehow they were caught, and so they were burned at the stake for that. 1522, Martin Luther translates the New Testament into German. And then 12 years later, his Old Testament comes out. 1522, the first New Testament in Dutch comes out. 1524, the first New Testament in Danish comes out, and suddenly there's a flood. And so the reason I make a big deal about Erasmus, Tim, if we can get that book up here again. And so this Greek New Testament that comes out, and Erasmus, it starts a flood, or you could think of it as a wildfire that starts as a result of taking a step back further to more original manuscripts. And God causes a flood to happen where all around Europe, in every country, within a period of 30 years or so after this, country after country, they start getting the New Testament in their own language. So if you're brave enough to do it, you can read the Bible in a language you actually understand, because throughout all of Europe, everyone went to church and listened to a service in Latin, and listened to the Bible read to you in Latin, and nobody understood it. Nobody spoke Latin anymore. The Roman Empire had ceased to exist 1100 years ago. The only people that spoke Latin were scholars and some clergymen, kind of thing. So it's just amazing that it's like a tidal wave or a forest fire that begins, that people suddenly want to be able to read the Bible in their own language. And when people read the Bible in their own language, tremendous things begin to happen, which comes back to the question I asked from the end of last week. Next week, we're about to see there is a ferocious response to this by government officials and church officials. People are hungry for the Word of God in their own language, and the church and the government want nothing to do with this. They want to stamp it out. And so...
the person who started that trend, if you will, was Martin Luther.
it's interesting that the person that started the trend was really Erasmus, by publishing a Greek New Testament, that suddenly it ignited a new interest in Bible study, and hey, we can translate from Greek instead of translating the Latin Vulgate. Instead of translating a translation, we're going to translate from Greek. And it seemed to start a forest fire that everyone suddenly thought, hey, we'll translate, at least if you're a Protestant, we'll translate from Greek into our own language, whatever that is. And so I'm going in chronological order, so next week the flood continues. Just language after language after language, they suddenly, for the first time in history, have the New Testament in their own language that ordinary people can read. As I said, the response of the church is ferocious. People are slaughtered left and right. And it's a fascinating history, part of the history of how we got the Bible. So in...
So they understood Greek, so they
Yeah.
understood Greek enough?
say that
They
again?
didn't understand Latin, but they understood Greek enough that they could...
Scholars did, not everyday people. So scholars somehow, well, at the same time, the Renaissance was happening, and so there had been a renewal in ancient languages, and reading people like Aristotle and Socrates and Plato and so on, and studying Greek, and it was all a part of that. So as nation after nation got the Bible in their own language, and just a blacksmith could now read the Bible, or a farmhand could read the Bible, just amazing things started to happen. Say it again?
If they could afford it.
If they could afford it, yeah. Where they could get a page.
This wasn't at the point where anybody could just get one.
No, so that's still coming. Yeah, and so, that came along later. But this is an actual reproduction. I'll pass it around next week. You can see it's basically photographs of what was not a modern day. It's a photograph of an actual copy of Tyndale's translation. Pretty amazing.
I would think that they were reading often Latin. I get pretty disinterested in going to church, but they must have moved into, okay, now I will speak to you.
Yeah,
what I've read.
they would have a sermon, and so the reality is most people couldn't read anyway.
Yeah.
And so suddenly, so a lot of things are tied together here. Having the Bible available in your own language spurs you to want to learn to read.
Sure. Use that as your
Yeah.
language.
So up until then, if you couldn't read, that's where stained glass windows come in. The stained glass window tells you a story. They also had plays, morality type plays that would tell Bible stories, and so you would watch a play and learn a story. And sermons obviously would be not in Latin, they would be in your own language. And so you'd have to take the priest's word for it, that what he was telling you was the truth. So
If you didn't show up to church, you might not ever show up anywhere again.
well, that's right. It was illegal not to show up in church.
Yeah.
And so the police would come and get you if you weren't at church or if you missed.
Oh, that's
Oh,
one,
yeah.
that's one way you could get new members.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, see, that's why Harvest Ministry should have a membership list and someone at the back checking attendance. When I went to Bible college, we were required to go to chapel every day during the week, so 5 times a week,
With a suit and tie.
with a suit and tie.
And when was that for?
It's in the 70s. And they had a balcony. Now, for me, 73 to 76, 3 years, there would be one of the staff people was in a balcony up above. You had assigned seating. If your seat was empty, you got a black mark against you, and if you got about 3 marks against you, then you're in big trouble. And I remember I missed chapel one day or something. I was sick. I don't know what it was, but I got in trouble. So it's a similar idea that if you weren't in church, and this carried on for hundreds of years in early New England, for example, in the United States, if you weren't at church, the police were coming for you. So it was interesting times. So what time is it? That's all I have for tonight.
Almost quarter after the clock.
Okay, so that's perfect timing. So any questions on anything? Did I confuse you on anything or not make anything clear enough? Yes, Becky.
Could you start over?
On the way home, I'll give you well, it's going to be on a CD or something. And so you can put it on
This whole thing would have been a tremendous threat to the church.
tremendously. Otherwise, you can't explain the response. Why does the church want to kill people for reading the Bible? Because they're threatened. And some of the people who are getting killed, I've read a lot of books. I've been studying this now since 1973, and I've read dozens and dozens of books on the topic. And I read one just maybe a month ago called The Burning Time. And I actually had nightmares, many nights wondering, okay, if they're torturing me on the rack, like they did with Anne Askew, she was 24 years old, and they tortured her so much that when they took her to the stake to burn her, she couldn't walk. They had to carry her because all her bones were broken, and they tie her up. And interestingly, one of her friends bribed the executioner to tie a little bag of gunpowder around her neck. So instead of slowly roasting to death, when the fire got to the gunpowder, boom, blew up and blew her head off and killed her. And so she's 24, but she refused to give in for what she believed to be true, and what she believed to be true came from this book. It was this book that she had read. And so you have to wonder, and so that's the church killing her for reading this book. What would I have the guts, like that 24-year-old girl, to say, no, this is what I believe, what's in this book, instead of what you've been telling me for the last 1,500 years, kind of thing.
So what's happening is not the average Joe, but mostly scholars and the people with education.
Initially. So now, see, I'm into next week now. So these are people reading it in English, or there were groups of people who would secretly meet. It's like my friend in Vietnam, who I mentioned, not maybe everyone was here. So there's lots of fervent Christians in Vietnam. And so at the church he attends, they've requested from the government, can we expand our church? We have too many people. And they say, no, you can't. So the solution, and Al, you can imagine this, they have 7 services every Sunday. First service, 6 a.m. And then they go, I don't know how much of a gap between them, 7 services right in a row, and in order to get them all in. It's illegal to meet in a house. Christians cannot meet in a house. And at every service, there's police officers there watching and listening to make sure everything's done prim and proper, nothing negative said about the government. So what starts happening in England that we'll learn about next week? People, instead of meeting at the cathedral in the center of town, they start meeting in houses. There's somebody who can read and has one of these illegal Bibles, starts reading to the group. And they start questioning and wondering, what they've been telling me all my life, I can't find it in here anywhere. And so there's a new boldness, and bold enough that people can be tortured and refuse to give up their beliefs. And so it's like there's 2 camps all of a sudden, the official church and another church is rising up that is tending to believe what's written in this book instead of tradition.
This is at today's discussion, this is happening more at the educated level. So folks in universities,
Yeah. And they're going to influence other people. And so I think it was, Tyndale, and maybe it was Wycliffe who had said, if God carries on and people are able to read the Bible in their own language, said, I look forward to the day when a simple plowboy knows the Word of God better than you do, talking to a bishop. And so that's what was happening. So people who are being brought to courts and charged with crime of reading the Bible in English. They're quoting the Bible, and they know the Bible better than the bishops and archbishops and so on. And that's why the church didn't want this to happen, because exactly what they feared is happening. They're losing control. And it's a huge topic. We got into it last week, the whole idea of Christendom, where because I'm born in Canada, therefore I'm a Christian. And these people start thinking, just because I'm born in England doesn't necessarily make me a Christian. It looks like I have to have a relationship with somebody called Jesus, instead of I just happen to be born here, therefore I'm a Christian. And so it's absolutely...
Did you choose that then?
Pardon me?
That's what you're saying, Father? So your point is they were getting in tune with that idea.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Because they were starting to see a lot of stuff I've been told over the centuries I can't find in here. And when I asked the bishop about it, he can't find it in there. And his response is anger, and I think I'd better kill you. And so we call it the Reformation now. The people were suddenly, the way the church had been for 1,000 years was being challenged. All because of getting the book in your own language and being able to read it for yourself. It's amazing. Any other questions?